A Brief History of Climate Change. BBC News environment correspondent Richard Black traces key milestones, scientific discoveries, technical innovations, and political action. 1712. British ironmonger Thomas Newcomen invents the first widely used steam engine, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution and industrial-scale use of coal. 1800. World population reaches 1 billion. 1824. French physicist Joseph Fourier describes the Earth's natural greenhouse effect. He writes, "The temperature of the Earth can be augmented by the interposition of the atmosphere, because heat in the state of light finds less resistance in penetrating the air than in repassing into the air when converted into non-luminous heat." 1861. Irish physicist John Tyndall shows that water vapor and certain other gases create the greenhouse effect. This aqueous vapor is a blanket more necessary to the vegetable life of England than clothing is to man, he concludes. More than a century later, he is honored by having a prominent UK climate research organization, the Tyndall Centre, named after him. 1886. Carl Benz unveils the motor wagon, often regarded as the first true automobile. 1896. Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius concludes that industrial-age coal burning will enhance the natural greenhouse effect. He suggests this might be beneficial for future generations. His conclusions on the likely size of the man-made greenhouse are in the same ballpark, a few degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2 as modern-day climate models. 1900, another Swede, Knut Engström, discovers that even at the tiny concentrations found in the atmosphere, CO2 strongly absorbs parts of the infrared spectrum. Although he does not realize the significance, Engström has shown that a trace gas can produce greenhouse warming. 1927, carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning and industry reach 1 billion tons per year. 1930, human population reaches 2 billion. 1938. Using records from 147 weather stations around the world, British engineer Guy Callender shows that temperatures had risen over the previous century. He also shows that CO2 concentrations had increased over the same period and suggests this caused the warming. The Callender effect is widely dismissed by meteorologists. 1955. Using a new generation of equipment, including early computers, U.S. researcher Gilbert Plass analyses in detail the infrared absorption of various gases. He concludes that doubling CO2 concentrations would increase temperatures by 3-4°C. 1957, U.S. oceanographer Roger Revelle and chemist Hans Suess show that seawater will not absorb all the additional CO2 entering the atmosphere, as many had assumed. Revelle writes, "Human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment." 1958. Using equipment he had developed himself, Charles David Dave Keeling begins systematic measurements of atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa in Hawaii and in Antarctica. Within 4 years, the project, which continues today, provides the first unequivocal proof that CO2 concentrations are rising. 1960, human population reaches 3 billion. 1965, a U.S. President's Advisory Committee panel warns that the greenhouse effect is a matter of real concern. 1972, first UN Environment Conference in Stockholm. Climate change hardly registers on the agenda, which centers on issues such as chemical pollution, atomic bomb testing, and whaling. The United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, is formed as a result. 1975, human population reaches 4 billion. 1975, U.S. scientist Wallace Broecker puts the term global warming into the public domain in the title of a scientific paper. 1987, human population reaches 5 billion. 1987, Montreal Protocol agreed, restricting chemicals that damage the ozone layer. Although not established with climate change in mind, it has had a greater impact on greenhouse gas emissions than the Kyoto Protocol. 1988. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, formed to collate and assess evidence on climate change. 1989. UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, possessor of a chemistry degree, warns in a speech to the UN that we are seeing a vast increase in the amount of carbon dioxide reaching the atmosphere. The result is that change in future is likely to be more fundamental and more widespread than anything we have known hitherto. She calls for a global treaty on climate change. 1989. Carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning and industry reach 6 billion tons per year. 1990. IPCC produces first assessment report. It concludes that temperatures have risen by 0.3-0.6 C over the last century, that humanity's emissions are adding to the atmosphere's natural complement of greenhouse gases, and that the addition would be expected to result in warming. 1992. At the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, governments agree the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. Its key objective is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Developed countries agree to return their emissions to 1990 levels. 1995. IPCC's second assessment report concludes that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the Earth's climate. This has been called the first definitive statement that humans are responsible for climate change. 1997. Kyoto Protocol agreed. Developed nations pledged to reduce emissions by an average of 5% by the period 2008 to 12, with wide variations on targets for individual countries. U.S. Senate immediately declares it will not ratify the treaty. 1998. Strong El Niño conditions combine with global warming to produce the warmest year on record. The average global temperature reached 0.52 C above the mean for the period 1961 to 90, a commonly used baseline. 1998. Publication of the controversial hockey stick graph indicating that modern-day temperature rise in the Northern Hemisphere is unusual compared with the last 1,000 years. The work would later be the subject of 2 inquiries instigated by the U.S. Congress. 1999. Human population reaches 6 billion. 2001. President George W. Bush removes the U.S. from the Kyoto process. 2001. IPCC Third Assessment Report finds new and stronger evidence that humanity's emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause of the warming seen in the second half of the 20th century. 2005. The Kyoto Protocol becomes international law for those countries still inside it. 2005. UK Prime Minister Tony Blair selects climate change as a priority for his terms as chair of the G8 and president of the EU. 2006. The Stern Review concludes that climate change could damage global GDP by up to 20% if left unchecked, but curbing it would cost about 1% of global GDP. 2006. Carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning and industry reach 8 billion tons per year. 2007. The IPCC's fourth assessment report concludes it is more than 90% likely that humanity's emissions of greenhouse gases are responsible for modern-day climate change. 2007. The IPCC and former U.S. Vice President Al Gore received the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such change. 2007. At UN negotiations in Bali, governments agree the 2-year Bali Roadmap, aimed at hammering out a new global treaty by the end of 2009. 2008. Half a century after beginning observations at Mauna Loa, the Keeling Project shows that CO2 concentrations have risen from 315 parts per million ppm in 1958 to 380 ppm in 2008. 2008, 2 months before taking office, incoming U.S. President Barack Obama pledges to engage vigorously with the rest of the world on climate change. 2009, China overtakes the U.S. as the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, although the U.S. remains well ahead on a per capita basis. 2009, computer hackers download a huge tranche of emails from a server at the University of East Anglia's Climatic Research Unit and release some on the internet, leading to the ClimateGate affair. 2009 to 192 governments convene for the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen with expectations of a new global agreement high, but they leave only with a controversial political declaration, the Copenhagen Accord. 2010, developed countries begin contributing to a $30 billion, three-year deal on Fast Start finance to help them green their economies and adapt to climate impacts. 2010, a series of reviews into ClimateGate and the IPCC ask for more openness, but clear scientists of malpractice. 2010, the UN summit in Mexico does not collapse, as had been feared, but ends with agreements on a number of issues. 2011, a new analysis of the Earth's temperature record by scientists concerned over the ClimateGate allegations proves the planet's land surface really has warmed over the last century. 2011, human population reaches 7 billion. 2011, data shows concentrations of greenhouse gases are rising faster than in previous years. 2012, Arctic sea ice reaches a minimum extent of 3.41 million square kilometers, 1.32 million square miles, a record for the lowest summer cover since satellite measurements began in 1979. 2013, the Mauna Loa Observatory on Hawaii reports that the daily mean concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has surpassed 400 parts per million, ppm, for the first time since measurements began in 1958. 2013, the first part of the IPCC's fifth assessment report says scientists are 95% certain that humans are the dominant cause of global warming since the 1950s. The BBC is not responsible for the content of external sites.